tend to think, I believe, of this new social vision, social justice, as something completely contemporary. But you write that it has been prevalent for half a century. You also argue not merely that it is mistaken, but that it has done positive harm.
Yes.
Discrimination and disparities. With the prevailing social vision came a more non-judgmental approach to behavior, as well as multiculturalism, a de-emphasis on policing and punishments, and an emphasis on demographically based fair shares for all. So what you're talking about here is not explicitly governmental action or government programs, but the way people begin thinking about society. In the United States, you continue murder rates, rates of infection with venereal diseases, and rates of teenage pregnancies were among the social pathologies whose steep declines in the 1950s reverse and begin to get worse in the 1960s. Okay. Ideas alone, it's what people carry in their heads.
But the ideas were carried out in policies. And the classic place were in public housing projects. People today think of the public housing projects as really just a bedlam and violence and so forth.
Drug dens and so forth.
Yeah. I remember in the 1940s, one of our relatives was admitted to a public housing project in New York, and we were so proud because back in those days, you got admitted because even though you were just a working person, you had a good record, you had a steady job. Women with fatherless children were not admitted, and so on. And so it was not just that the place was good; it was that it was an honor that he'd passed these tests to get into these places.
You tell a tale of two blackouts that illustrate what's taking place here. The first blackout takes place in November 1965. I can actually remember that. We lived in upstate New York.
I lived in upstate New York.
And there was a moment, I can remember when we were having dinner and the lights in the house went dark and then came back up for a moment. We all looked at each other and thought, what just happened there? Well, of course, when we turned on the television, we found out what happened. Huge power outage in New York City, whereas upstate, the lights just went down and came back on. In New York City, the city went black for a whole night.
Yes.
And you write that night the crime rate was lower than usual, 1965. Second blackout, very similar event, takes place in July 1977, and you write again, New York City was again dark throughout the night, but now there was widespread looting and arson.
Yes.
65 people behaved themselves in New York City in the dark.
Yes.
And in 70, so what happens in those 12 years?
This was one of the many things that turned to the worst in the 1960s. There's a whole slew of them. Steven Pinker has a book about international murder rates, and he said the general trend over the centuries is for the murder rate to go down, but in the 1960s the rate did a U-turn, as he put it. It went right up, and this was common across Western societies.
And it is because of
the same vision out there.
And the vision. So I'm trying to, I guess one thing I'm trying to get at here is the extent to which. How does it work itself out? Are the cops, because of this new social vision between 1965, people know that if they try looting or arson, the cops will come right at them?
No.
There's
only so much the cops can do. The first line of defense is morality and the law as a statement of what the principles are. You delegitimize that, and all you've got are the police. There aren't that many police. You could double the number of policemen, and if you destroy the morality, you're not getting anywhere.
So in 1965, people who'd grown up, let's see, 65, that's going to be dominated by people who'd been through, the adults in 65 remember the Depression.
Yes.
They remember the Second World War.
Yes.
They've had the experience of rebuilding the country in the 1950s, and they take for granted what we would now term traditional morality. Is that correct?
Yes.
You just don't steal things.
Yes.
You don't destroy property.
Yes.
So what,
Well, no, another example,
Yeah.
there was the Exchange Buffet restaurant that I mentioned.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I actually remember going to those. And the
So
Exchange
just
Buffet,
explain what's going
the
on.
Exchange Buffet, you go in and you go through the line and pick up your own food, and then you bring your dishes over to be there, and then you come to the cashier and you tell the cashier how much you owe.
And there were 70 some of these restaurants there were a lot of them in New York.
Dozens.
Dozens. All right.
All right, and they lasted for 78 years. In the 1960s, they collapsed because people no longer were honest.
All right.
In England, it was even more dramatic because they really sort of set the standard for self-controlled societies. And of course, if you have a lot of self-control, you don't need a lot of government control.
Right.
But if you don't have it, the government is not going to be enough by itself. And the government itself is often tainted, as it were, by these same ideas that for example, in London in 1954, there were a grand total of 12 armed robberies in the city of London that year, at a time when anybody could buy a shotgun with no questions asked. Fast forward a couple of decades, and they're at 1,400 armed robberies in London, despite some of the most strict gun control laws in the world.
Got it. I'm still struck. What do we make about the speed with which society changes? Again, you've got what I love about the two blackouts is because they're two snapshots. They're almost literally what do people get up to when they think nobody's looking, when the lights go out. And it's just a dozen years between good behavior, people helping each other out in this difficult night, and terrible behavior where they're looting and setting fire to property. And how is it that ideas, the wrong ideas, can percolate through, can so change behavior in such a brief period of time?
Well, it was going. I mean, these ideas weren't invented in the 1960s.
Right.
But the number of people who progressively moved towards those ideas greatly increased, and the whole political and intellectual scene was very different.